Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'll be discussing Prime Minister's questions from yesterday, or as the Daily Mirror, apparently, Daily Mirror, which is a left-wing paper. I didn't see this for myself, but I've no reason to disbelieve it. Someone was suggesting it published the schedule for parliamentary business yesterday, and it had, the usual things, but then for 12 o'clock, which is when Prime Minister's questions is, apparently it had said something like 12 noon, Prime Minister's questions and evasions. And that's certainly what we got yet again, as Boris Johnson seems to claim that in the middle of a pandemic is not really the time to learn lessons about the pandemic. That's best put off for afterwards when it's all over. Okay then. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So first of all, I normally, and I will do in this one as well, talk about the questions asked by Keir Starmer, leader of the opposition, leader of Labour, and Ian Blackford, leader of the second largest opposition party, the SNP in Westminster. But I'm going to start off with a backbencher, a Conservative MP, who asked a question of Boris Johnson first of all. And the reason I want to point this out is because I've talked recently about, and I know it's feeding into what I'd imagined anyway, so I have to be a little bit careful. It's not just feeding into my bias on this one, but I've sort of believed that 2021 is the year that sees Boris Johnson gone. And so therefore you look for the signs for it, don't you? We've had Steve Baker, prominent Brexiteer backbencher, publicly threatening Boris Johnson with a leadership challenge. Not that he'd want to take over, but, threatening to trigger a leadership election. We've had Priti Patel recently. The cabinet have been thick as thieves, but the Home Secretary has been actively and publicly briefing against the Prime Minister, not behind closed doors, in full view of the cameras, saying the Prime Minister got it all wrong last year. Well, all of it in terms of her area borders. And now we have a backbencher who was asking a question very forcefully of Boris Johnson. If you did not know that this was a Conservative MP, you would have imagined he was an opposition MP. Indeed, a Labour MP later on did actually ask a very similar question with a very similar tone. In fact, I would suggest that Ian Lavery, the Labour MP in question, was not as aggressive as this Conservative MP, who was asking why in his area the rollout of the vaccine seemed to be going very slowly. Because although we look at the rollout of the vaccine, in terms of the number of doses administered, it looks all right. I mean, we're in desperate need, but you can't, rush it too much. We're doing well. We've got the NHS to do it instead of their private chums. But there could well be regional disparities. There could be some regions where the rollout isn't going so well. This Conservative backbencher seemed to think that their area was being a bit left behind. It's quite forcefully asked. But anyway, on to Starmer's questions, so I'm actually going to start with Johnson's first response, because it's one of these that it's like, I'll give his response, then we'll see if we can guess the question. Because Boris Johnson, in response to the first question, says that he mourned every death. Now, without getting into any notion of, bollocks, does he? Does he hell mourn them? Because of course I'm going to say that. I think Conservatives as a breed tend to be quite selfish at the very least. And someone like Boris Johnson actively dismissive of anyone else's feelings. But I will point this out. He was still allowing, last March, he was still allowing mass gatherings to take place. We had the 250,000 jammed into Cheltenham, for example, the horse festival. And then, lo and behold, there was a spike in cases there. He allowed when Spain was in real trouble, when, Spain and Italy were leading the charge in Europe to begin with number of cases and deaths. And he allowed thousands of football fans from Madrid to come and watch the game with Liverpool, sorry. And lo and behold, there was spike in cases in Merseyside after that. He was allowing all these mass gatherings to take place. There was the Six Nations game as well. And this was after people were dying in this country. Now, I'm going to suggest this. If you took no action at all, even though it was being recommended, the World Health Organization had their recommendations out at this point that you avoid mass gatherings. If he was carrying on with mass gatherings saying that they should still go ahead, It's not just that he was allowing them. He'd publicly stated that they should go ahead. I don't think you're mourning those initial victims, at least. And I really don't think you're mourning any victims since. He couldn't even be bothered to turn up to the emergency Cobra meetings for a long time. People were dying and he still didn't turn up to them. Even when people were dying. So I'm going to say, I think I'm safe in saying that objectively, he's not mourning their deaths. He then repeated that he and his government took full responsibility and then proceeded, of course, to dodge all responsibility for everything. So what question do you think he was asked there? Because what the question was actually asked was, why does the Prime Minister think that we have the worst death toll in Europe? Phil, you've missed something out because you didn't actually cover what Boris Johnson said to that. No, I did cover what Boris Johnson said to that. He didn't answer the question, you see. Quite often what he does. I mean, you know, I missed the answer. Keir Starmer missed the answer as well, it seems. And he had to point this out. You know, so he asked again, why do we have the worst death toll in Europe? You know, why have we got one of the highest death rates in the world? You know, he said, and I think he's quite right on this point, that Johnson is going to have to answer that question one day. Well, I say that. If Boris Johnson intends to stay on as Prime Minister, then yes, at some point, because it's always about later, isn't it? It's always about later with him. At some point, the pandemic is going to be over, not thanks to any of his efforts. He said, someday you're going to have to answer this question, and really you should have the decency to answer it today. He quoted the chief medical officer as saying that in order to get on top of this, you have to go in hard. You can't just stand and watch and wait. You know, he says, does he agree? Does, you know, the Prime Minister agree? To which then Johnson tried to, again, push the idea, oh, new virus, new variant, stuff like that. So what he's trying to do, you know, subconsciously is get into people's heads, oh, it's all completely unprecedented, this, we have no idea what to do. I mean, first of all, we know what, the idea of a viral pandemic is not completely new. The coronavirus that we have, the particular form of COVID-19, it has been new since 2019, but it's now 2021, by the way. But here's the thing. You don't actually get to complain that we don't know enough about the virus if you deliberately block attempts to investigate our response to see if there's ways to improve. Because before Starmer had even asked him about that, in fact, he didn't even ask him about that. I think Ed Davey did later on, the Lib Dem leader. But before anyone had even asked him, because he predicted the question, Boris Johnson said that there will be a time to learn lessons, but it's not now. If in the middle of an emergency is not the time to learn lessons, when is it? After the emergency? What, so that people in 100 years might have a better clue? Don't be ridiculous, man. You know, but there we go. But the thing is, you know, it was a new virus in 2019, sort of. It isn't now. Variants are new, yes, but again, we know from experts that actually coronavirus variants don't actually differ. Their nature doesn't really differ that much. That's why we always have high hopes that when a new variant emerges, that the vaccine will still be useful against it. Obviously, you know, there are fears that a vaccine-resistant form could, and then we have to keep redeveloping the vaccines. Sure, but, you know, the idea that it's all new, that's labouring the point after this amount of time. For a lot of their things, it wasn't really valid a year ago because we knew we needed to test. We knew we needed PPE in hospitals. All of these things it made no difference about the particular peculiarities of COVID-19. There were certain things in terms of the way you deal with a viral pandemic that are just, you know, Robert Jenrick, government minister yesterday on the interviews, was trying to say, oh, there's no textbook for this sort of thing. Yeah, there is. There's loads of them. There's whole libraries full. There is. Anyway, Johnson then said, oh, there's no easy answers. Now, I would say this is true of some of his experts because, yeah, sometimes it is difficult. It's like the vaccine rollout. The idea, do you give people the vaccine at the correct amount, the correct time, the second dose, so you give maximum protection, but you can't vaccinate as many people? Or do you give some protection to twice as many people? That's a genuinely tricky prospect, and I've discussed this before. It is genuinely tricky, but that's for the experts. That's a difficult question for the experts. But the Prime Minister, for him, it's blindingly easy. Basically, he's assembled a crack team of top experts in virology, epidemiology, medicine, public health, behavioural psychology, mathematical modelling. He's got everyone he needs. All he has to do is make their suggestions work politically. That's it. That's his job. Then he pushed the idea of the vaccine rollout because this is what he does. This is his latest plaything. He whenever we're in a tight spot and Starmer's trying to say, look, we're in a mess here, he goes, but I've got my new toy. My new toy is going to sort it out. He said that 6.9 million people have had the vaccine. No, 6.9 million people have had a dose, a single dose, which is still, a good amount of doses to give out in just over a month. But the only person I know of who's had the maximum protection, in other words, the 2 doses at the right time, is Boris Johnson's dad. I'm sure there are some other Tories that have had it as well. But again, I can't find figures on how many, people have had that. And then Boris Johnson said something which I thought was remarkable, truly remarkable. He promised an exit strategy for how the country is going to come out of the pandemic. Not come out of the current lockdown, come out of the pandemic, he said. I wish Starmer had actually pressed him on that for his next question, actually, because I thought, that's interesting. Because opposition leaders have been asking for that for a year now. Oh, we're going to get an exit strategy. And again, it's still something he's promising for the future, but this is remarkable. An actual exit strategy from the whole pandemic. That's what he said. I wonder how soon. I wish Starmer would have asked him how soon. He didn't. What he did say, he said, look, the problem with the Prime Minister evading the questions as to, what vital lessons, could be learned, is that we won't learn those vital lessons. And then he reeled out all the areas where Boris Johnson was too slow. And after a year, it's quite extensive now in terms of lockdowns, PPE, protecting care homes, test and trace, yada, yada, yada. And he says, look, he fears that the Prime Minister still hasn't learnt the lesson. And he said, now the latest example is continued delay in securing our borders. And he said, look, we've known that variants exist since December, which is actually quite charitable of him. Reality, we've known for longer. The government have certainly known since September that we had one in this country because they were tracking it, or their team were tracking it. I'm sure the scientists were giving them the information. But it was announced in the Commons in December. So then Starmer said, look, we know these variants exist, but we don't always know the routes into the country. So why not test everyone coming into the country with the quarantine? Why can't that be put in place today, he said. Which echoed something that Ian Blackford picked up on as well in his. So, as usual, what Boris Johnson does, there's a certain pattern emerges. We've been used to it now. So he seeks to avoid answering the questions, but he can't just answer his own questions 6 times because, even people who are not really paying that much attention are going to notice that. So then what he does is he tries to go on the attack. So he switches to making stuff up about whichever party's having a pop at him, Labour in this case. So he says, Starmer's twisting the situation. As others have pointed out, so Johnson has a bit of a habit of complaining about people politically point scoring against him, by which he means asking him difficult questions that the public should have a right to know the answer to. And then he engages in political point scoring himself, usually taking the form of inventing policies or statements allegedly produced by those opposition parties that know nothing about it. Needless to say, he didn't answer the question again. But yeah, I think he just realises he can't just evade the question every time. Sometimes he has to distract as well from the fact that he's evading the question. I think really what he's trying to do is to try and draw Starmer in. Because again, some politicians at work, the more hot-blooded politicians, I know some people will say, like a bit more fire in the belly with Starmer. And I would agree, I would love it if he really, had the righteous indignation about him, which is what you want from an opposition leader. That being said, it's not him. He's the cool, calm, collected prosecutor. But at the same time, much to Johnson's annoyance, it also means he's not going to be drawn into pointless arguments either. So then Starmer just moves seamlessly on to the row with Priti Patel. That he went on about last week. He spent a couple of questions talking about last week, but again, probably to a smaller audience last week because it took place when America was busy evicting Trump. Hasn't it been interesting the last 7 days? It's almost been boring. We haven't had the the ragers. We haven't had the orange one raging. There's still been plenty coming out of there, but it's almost like America has a government now. Interesting. Anyway, back to our government. So then Starmer, was basically saying about Priti Patel, look, she's telling anyone who will listen that the Prime Minister didn't do enough on borders last year, which is obviously poking at intra-governmental friction here. Like I said last week, it makes no difference whether Priti Patel is telling the truth when she says she argued for border closures last March and Boris Johnson overruled her. We don't need to worry about whether it's true or not. I suspect it's not true, quite frankly. I suspect it's not true. But it doesn't matter. The point is that she is publicly attacking Boris Johnson. And I suspect Labour do not want to miss an opportunity to point this out to anyone who's listening. So then Starmer turned to schools, which was one time Boris Johnson's favourite subject, and suggested that teachers and support workers could be vaccinated in the half-term break. Give a golden opportunity, he says, to get teachers and support workers vaccinated. To which Johnson said, well, of course they should be vaccinated. He says if they are in this 1 to 9 category system he has, which is the first 9 categories of people to be vaccinated. So the thing is that the teachers aren't specifically in that system. I mean, teachers are people too, so they're in there somewhere. But what it means is, so at the moment, if you're, in terms of getting a vaccination for the half term, if you're for some reason a 90-year-old still teaching, it's not generally possible, but if you were, then you might be in for a vaccination appointment at some point. But it's not really tackling the issue. He's talking about teachers as a specific cohort. And so he's not talking about teachers who may happen to be extremely vulnerable and actually wouldn't be in the school anyway. Because they're extremely vulnerable, they'd be shielding. He's talking about teachers as a high-risk group in themselves because we are of necessity crammed into and I know some schools and colleges are doing better than others, but, as an industry, a lot of teachers are going into non-COVID secure settings on a daily basis, surrounded by people not wearing face masks, even though they will be. And bear in mind that schools are still open to certain kids. So there are teachers teaching classes, physical classes at the moment. And even though the schools are sort of technically shut, they're not actually shut. And in some areas, there'll be quite a few kids in there. And then Johnson said that schools are safe. He seemed to imply that schools are safe. The problem is, it's the school children who go there. That is something, isn't it? So the schools are safe. It's the school children that are the hazard. All right. So it's not the bullet that was the problem. It was the loss of blood that came from it. I understand now. But what he was trying to do, of course, was to get Starmer to say that schools are safe. He's been trying this for a year now. It's basically an old management trick. I might have talked about this before. I've seen it before. So a manager often, a confident manager wouldn't need to do this, but a rubbish manager. So they want to do something in their team, they get their ideas. Some people in the team go, well, I don't think that'll work. I think you'll get these consequences. I think maybe this will be a better idea. And the manager wants to go ahead with it for whatever reason. They don't cope with thinking around problems. But they also foresee a future, because they're a bad manager, they'll come across this before. So they foresee a future when it does go badly wrong, and they don't want this guy who said, I think this is going to go badly wrong, going, I told you so. So they go, right, I need to implicate them all. So if it goes wrong, we all need to be in this together. So they try and get everyone to agree on the course of action. And they pull rank to do so. And as I've said in the past, when I've generally had quite good managers, I have to say, but on the odd occasion when I haven't, I don't play that game. If they go, this is the way we're doing it, I go, fine, you're the boss, but it's going to go wrong. And when it goes wrong, I'm going to tell you how it went wrong and what I said we should have done instead. And that's all there is to it. Those sort of managers don't really like me. But it is a classic management trick. It's trying to get everyone, so that if Starmer says they're safe and then, well, you said they were safe as well. No. So that's all that's about. And then Starmer had to point out, as he always should in my view, that Johnson still hadn't actually answered the question. He said, I'm none the wiser here. I was talking about vaccinating teachers and support workers in the February half term. Are you in favour of that? I'm not sure if you're in favour of that. Is that a good idea? Is it a bad idea? So, and then he also brought up that some kids are still not able to learn at home. Government have been challenged on this for nearly a year, he said, and we've still got a third of families saying they don't have enough computers and laptops. Now, at this point, it's quite interesting. Johnson got a bit ratty. In fact, he got very ratty. He was visibly frustrated, got a bit aggressive. And of all the lines of attack that Johnson has faced, because I would argue the ones that would, I know why this is, I'm going to explain why I think this is any minute, but you'd have thought the ones that showed him up to be the biggest buffoon with an egomaniac like that would be the ones that rattle his cage. But this one was just a simple, something he could easily blame on his education secretary and who will be ultimately responsible. And I think it's because it's the education of kids here, which is a hot button issue for voters. In terms of the sorts of people who turn up to vote, and that's what politicians like Johnson will be focused on. Who are their support base? Not, in terms of the majority of the country. They didn't have the majority of the country support him even in the election, let alone now. But who are the ones he relies on? And working parents. So I think Johnson was getting stroppy not because it was a particularly damaging line of attack, but because it was a line of attack exposing him in the eyes of an important demographic. And because, I know there's been other lines that exposed him as failing, say, the elderly, which is also a key voter base for the Conservatives, but he probably thinks he's done enough to stop most of them ever seeing a ballot box again. But working parents, another matter. He can't kill all of those. He probably doesn't even want to. I'll tell you what I found amusing as well, is that Boris Johnson said he'd be making a statement in a few minutes to address this. He was visibly irritated because Starmer was asking him a question, and it was to do with the opening of school. And Boris Johnson, his statement later on, he announced that our aim now is to open schools on the 8th of March, which is an aim, not a definite thing. And so he's obviously, that's his prepared statement for later on. But Starmer was asking about schools, and Boris Johnson, it's like he got visibly frustrated. I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes. As Keir Starmer said, but I'm asking you now. It's like, Johnson couldn't get it. I told you I was going to talk about this in a few minutes. The problem is, Prime Minister, that ordinarily if someone said that, you might go, okay, fair enough, I'll move on. But Boris Johnson often promises things for the future that never arrive. So the fact that he said he was going to make a statement doesn't mean he's going to answer my question. That's the thing. But he doesn't understand it. I said I was going to talk about it. I don't understand. Anyway, usual thing. Then he said, absolutely critical, that I think the leader of the opposition, or whatever he called him, right honourable gentleman or whatever, needs to say that schools are safe. This is absolutely critical for getting kids back into school. I thought, hang on, what? In order to get kids back into school, it's critical that the leader of the opposition says that schools are safe. That's critical, is it? That's how that works? It's the government that decides when the school's open. It's the government that takes responsibility for the success or the failure of that policy. But like I said, management trick. He's trying to get culpability. The Speaker did have to remind Boris Johnson that this is questions for the Prime Minister. He's had to do that a lot. And then Starmer pointed out, again, make it clear to anyone watching, look, every week, Prime Minister comes with his pre-prepared lines. He said, look, when 100,000 people have died, he should take time to answer the question. When 1 in 3 families are saying they don't have enough laptops or computers, his answers are simply not good enough. He said, look, we're nearly a year into this pandemic. This hasn't happened over the last few weeks. Those children are going without homeschooling. And I think what Starmer was doing here, when you looked at the opening, the way he opened this effectively his last question, I think, it was his 6th question. It could have gone in any number of areas. He could have gone down, the deaths route. He could have gone down the schooling route, which is what he did. He could have gone down the test and trace route. He could have gone down any. He touched on a lot of these areas. The fact that he decided to focus in on those, the homeschooling issue, I suspect is because that's what visibly rattled Johnson. So I think that's where he went, right, so that's what I'm going to go with. Which I think is always a good idea. I mean, this is what I say. You obviously do pre-prepare things to a certain extent. You prepare for Prime Minister's questions, both as the Prime Minister and someone who's going to ask him questions. But at the same time, you need to actually be flexible. And when you get an opening, when you've got him, when you've got the Prime Minister on the ropes, that's what you need to focus on. But then he also finished, because he knows that he's not going to get an answer to this. I mean, he hasn't got an answer to any of the others, but he knows that Boris Johnson is just going to grandstand. As I say, I've said before, Starmer could just say, and for my final question, I'd like to know what the Prime Minister's favourite colour is. And is it blue like his eyes? I don't actually know what colour his eyes are. Actually, can I see? No, I still don't know what they are. They might be blue. Because it doesn't matter. Boris Johnson has his pre-prepared script. It's just, that's what he just goes into. And you can tell he's pre-prepared as well, not just because it has no bearing to anything that's been asked, but because he adopts a different tone. You know how you have a different tone? So I have a particular way of speaking to camera here. I have a particular way of speaking to friends and family. I have a telephone manner. And I have a particular way of speaking to my class as a teacher. I have my teacher speak. And, so you have different... And so if someone sort of knows you or they listen to you enough, they can sort of tell which mode you're in. And Boris Johnson goes into a completely different mode for his sixth response. So it's always it's the pre-prepared fiery rant speech. But there you go. There's no point in going over that. But then Starmer but he did ask for his last one, knowing he wasn't going to get anything, by reminding people who don't, because there are people who don't care about the health issues and they don't care about the homeschooling because they don't have kids or they don't care about their own kids. But they care about the economy. It's like, yeah, but we don't care about the old people. We need to keep the economy moving. So he reminded people that we also have the worst economic performance of any advanced nation. And I'm sure this line was for another group. He also said, our schools are closed and our borders are open. And then he also finally put in one saying he was meeting families of COVID victims that afternoon. Something Johnson kept saying last year that he was going to and never did. And Starmer asked if he could pass a message on. Because he says, the last time I asked this, you gave a bit of a glib reply. I can't remember what he said exactly, which didn't go down well. And then, of course, Johnson got up and did his pre-prepared rant. Never mind that. On to Ian Blackford's. And he actually did sort of come at this from pretty much two angles. He did actually ask two questions. Often it's very difficult with two questions. So, and Ian Blackford, to be fair, and I've said this before, to be fair to him, he knows that Boris Johnson will not really answer the first and certainly not answer the second. So sometimes you just sort of feel, Ian Blackford sometimes just goes on a bit of a rant himself for a second. But this time he asked two actual questions. First one poking at Boris Johnson's piss poor leadership, U-turns, inconsistent messaging, wrong policies, that sort of thing. And he quoted scientists as saying, look, the government are responsible for the poor decisions that have led to all this. And he asked about, that. And Johnson said in response, look, I followed the scientific advice. He maintains that he followed the scientific advice, which is absolute nonsense. Because not only do we know what the scientists advised, like in the early days, they tried to keep under wraps what the scientists were advising, so there was an element of doubt. I mean, we knew there wasn't an element of doubt because there were independent scientists saying what should have happened, and you don't imagine that the independent scientists would have come to different conclusions to the government's own scientists, because the thing about science is, I know sometimes with a tricky situation, the conclusion won't always be exactly the same, but it's not going to be the polar opposite either. But since then, since it became clear, because if you remember the narrative, ministers began by trying to blame the problems on the scientists for giving poor advice, to which the scientists then went, no, we didn't advise this, and they started going public then. So we now know what the scientists advise because they're sick of the government trying to mech out that they weren't advising certain things, and they just go public with it. So we know what they're advising and we know what's happening. So therefore, when what they're advising isn't happening, we know that they're not following the advice. And the other thing is, various senior ministers, including the Chancellor at least, have actually gone on record as saying they're the ones that make the decision, not the scientists. Rishi Sunak several times last year said, yeah, we listen to them. We don't do what they say. We do what we think is best. So, nonsense. Then Blackford called for more financial help, to which Johnson just banged on about all the help he's being, we've been putting our arms around people. Can you not put your arms around people? We're in a pandemic here, mate. But he kept banging on about all the help he's given. But again, Whenever he talks about all this stuff we've done, it's like, yeah, but the question is it enough? There's 3 million people in this country that haven't received a penny of support. Not a penny. Because they're falling in the cracks of your system there, you know, amongst the self-employed. So they haven't had a penny. So you haven't actually given all this help. And I think Blackford was probably asking about ordinary citizens. I know he's helped friends, donors and other, you know, colleagues and other contacts in the Conservative Party. I think what Ian Blackford's asking about is the people who actually need the help, not the people who've been buying second and third homes on the proceeds of the help they've been given. I think that's what he was probably asking. But there it is. Those are Prime Minister's questions for another week. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.